There's an intriguing little book that's entitled Honor and Glory that really elucidates for us what that gospel that was just read is really challenging us to. In it, the author reflects on the characters of two well-known men of history, George Washington and Benedict Arnold. Both were dynamic men of action with unquestioned personal courage. Both were driven by passionate ambition from a very early age. Both were capable of inspiring the men they commanded to acts of extraordinary sacrifice and endurance. Both were hot-tempered by nature. Yet despite all the superficial similarities, one of them ended up a traitor, the other, of course, the father of our country. It all boiled down to character, a case, as the author, a longtime political speechwriter, named the book Honor versus Glory. George Washington was guided by an indestructible sense of honor. Benedict Arnold was driven by a thirst for personal glory and the perks it could bring. Both of these men hungered for greatness. But to Washington, greatness meant three things: the subordination of self to a greater cause, learning from mistakes, and then third, mastering personal weaknesses. But to Arnold, greatness meant triumph of self over others, wealth, privilege, and the indulgence of personal appetites. Now, when you look at this, none of this detracts from Arnold's achievements. He certainly helped drive out the British from Boston in the early part of the war. He took the offensive against the British in twin battles that ended in the surrender of an entire British army in Saratoga. But he also had a consistent pattern of insubordination, excessive drinking, and lavish overspending. He tried to recoup his fortunes through a marriage to a young society woman by the name of Peggy Shippen. And Shippen's connections led Arnold to a young British officer by the name of Major John Andre, who served as the middleman for Arnold's later treason. But ultimately, it was Arnold's own nature that was key to his betrayal. As the many real and imagined slights and humiliations piled up, he had no core sense of duty or honor to counterbalance the personal grievances. It was all about him. And so far as he was concerned, treason was just a career move. Both of these men were strong, but on the backside of every strength is its hidden weakness. It's Achilles' heel. So, if you are beautiful, the temptation is to use that beauty to open doors for your own ego, or to invest too much of your self-worth in superficial and temporary appearance. If you're wealthy, the temptation is to become possessed by your possessions, rather than to use them for God's glory and God's purposes. If you're popular or powerful, the temptation is to believe that you are essentially different from the rest of humanity, better than others, therefore worthy of their servitude and adoration. All of these gifts can make life great when channeled in the service of the world, and all of them can be distorted and wasted if used only for selfish ends. This is what the gospel is all about. This is what Jesus faced in the desert, this first Sunday of our Lenten season. He was tempted to glory, but he chose honor. And this theme has been the theme of great literature throughout the ages. You remember the great German legend Faust, who longed for restored youthfulness, fame, and fortune. Faust so longed for these that his yearning became obsessive. As you might recall, the devil offered Faust all that he wished. youth and fame and fortune, instant gratification for the whole duration of his life. But in exchange, Faust had to give the devil his soul for eternity when he died. Of course, the good deal did not look so nearly good when it came time for Faust to die. But by then, the die had been cast, and Faust faced eternity, facing the tragic consequences that befall those who make deals with the devil. That tale of Faust is retold in the writings of Marlowe and Goethe. It was staged by operas of Berlioz and Gounod, and it inspired a symphony by Liszt. And we hear it again in the Gospel, which came way before any of that great literature. The temptation to glory that we see in the Gospel this weekend is presented to all of us. This first Sunday of Lent, then, is a challenge to each one of us to confront our own character. We are each challenged during these 40 days to look at our own nature. And each one of us has to ask ourselves, what is my unique Achilles heel? In what ways do I hunger for personal greatness and seek glory rather than honor? You see, the temptations that Jesus faced in the desert are the temptations that we face every day of our lives and involve the choices that we make every day in our lives. In the desert, Jesus' character was challenged. Would he give in to worldly values, or would he follow the will of his Father? Would it be all about him, or could he subordinate himself to a greater cause? Benedict Arnold and Faust missed the truth. It cost their souls. George Washington understood it. He conquered his temptations. Jesus, of course, understood it. And in the end, though he gave up his life, he didn't trade in his soul. Our world today is certainly very different from the world of Jesus' time. We live in a world today that's overwhelmed by busyness, and it's changing faster than any of us can imagine or even cope. Thomas Friedman, in his latest book called Thank You for Being Late, tells us this. He says, on an average, the rate of technological change is now accelerating so fast it has risen above the average rate at which people can absorb all the changes that are taking place. He tells us that we are experiencing cultural angst. The world is not just rapidly changing, but it's being dramatically reshaped faster than any of us can reshape ourselves or our leadership, our institutions, our societies, our ethical choices. He makes an interesting point. He says that in the year 2007, that year constituted one of the greatest leaps forward in human history. Yet we have not slowed down to take it all in and reflect on it. We're way too busy. And when we are too busy, it is much easier to fall prey to all of those temptations in the desert. When we are too busy, it's much easier to believe that it's really all about me. When we're too busy, it's easy to forget real values. When we're too busy, it's much too easy to not pay attention to how my choices impact on everybody around me. Lent gives us 40 days to unbusy ourselves, to stop, to get off the merry-go-round, to look at ourselves seriously, to look at our choices, to acknowledge how our hunger for greatness, our search for glory, or our selfishness has tempted us to sell our souls to the devil. Lent calls us to slow down and reflect upon what greatness really is. The subordination of myself to a greater cause, learning from my mistakes, in struggling to master my personal weaknesses. We desperately need Lent in our world today. It's a world that's chaotic. So let's slow down. Let's take these 40 days to have a reflective look at ourselves. And let's all of us be part of the solution of the problems we see around us and not part of the cause.